Hey everybody, we're going to get started in just 1 minute. Give people a chance to get from one session to the other. And as you are joining, if you want to put in the chat where you're joining from, I love to see where people are coming from. If you're in the Chicago area, I'm actually in New Hampshire. And then I also have a poll. For anybody who's interested in participating, I'm always curious to see where people are seeing their biggest challenges today with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've got an E in there now. And is it around the recruiting aspects, or is it around the retention, the keeping people? Welcome. I see a few people joined. Thanks for joining. We'll give people a couple more minutes. And while you're getting acquainted, if you can just drop in the chat or answer the poll, let me know where you're joining from. I'm here in New Hampshire. I'm always curious about where people are joining from in these virtual events now, since we're not all in Chicago together. And then I also posted a poll, really curious about where people are seeing challenges today, whether it's in the space of recruiting or retention when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right. I'll get right going here. Awesome. So my name is Melissa Jurkoic. I'm the co-founder of an initiative called Diversify Thinking, really focused around raising the level of action to meet the level of conversation around diversity and inclusion. And of course, now the new player on the field, equity. And I'm also the Chief Customer Experience Officer at Adaptation, a tech startup here in the state of New Hampshire, where I'm coming from. For those of you that have just joined, if you want to drop in the chat just to share with everyone where you're joining from, I was always curious to see where people are joining virtual events from. And then I also have a poll. If you'd be willing to take the poll, it's really just, I'm curious where we're seeing it, people invest, and also where we're seeing people have challenges in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, whether that's in the recruiting aspect, which we'll talk a little bit today about, or in the inclusion side of things, like really retaining the people once you've invited them in. So you'll notice the talk I have today is really focused on startups. That's partly selfishly because I'm coming from the perspective of a startup. It's also because we've worked with startup leaders and leaders in other size organizations as well, with Diversify Thinking. So we definitely have some experience there. There's also a lot of data that's out there right now, because these are the companies of the future, these companies that are starting. And it just so happens that it's not an area of focus for them, but it's actually easier for them to build this in from day one. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. But that being said, I challenge all of you today that are joining us to look at this from the perspective of your own context. And we'll talk about that too. Like, what does that mean, your own context? But you could literally cross out startup here and it's still relevant to you. I promise you the data points, although they come from specific dimensions of diversity and from a startup space, they definitely have transferable relevance to whatever your domain is, as well as what size company you are. So don't leave the room. You will learn something today, and keep me honest. I love questions. So if you want to post things in the chat as they come to you, or you want to have a deeper discussion, I invite you to do that. And we can have some Q&A at the end if there's time. So I think a lot of people think we know what diversity is. It's the differences, right? It's the idea of people having different perspectives, different looks, different backgrounds. What we like to think about here, it's probably no surprise, is really around diversity of thought, which is why we're called Diversify Thinking, but also because we believe that's where the amazing innovation and power comes from. And I love this quote by Malcolm Forbes because it really represents that. It's an art form, right? To be able to come together from such different perspectives, backgrounds, personality types, and all that thinking that is unique to those individuals. They're still staying independent in their thought process, but bringing it all together. And the outcome there is pretty amazing when you're open to it. So I just want you to define diversity in this space. It's the art of thinking independently together. And I think those two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And that's really where the magic happens. So having that as sort of the base and definition of diversity, you also need to define it in your own context. What does it mean to you? What's important to you? We call these aspects of diversity dimensions. So there's many different dimensions of diversity. So the ones that are the de facto dimensions that you hear about every day, and a lot of the data points I'm going to share with you today are really focused around these two dimensions, are race and gender. Why? Because it's what we can see. It's easy to measure. It's easy to count how many people in your organization are of a particular gender or of a particular race or color. Like those things are easy because we can see them. There's a ton of other dimensions of diversity that we don't see a lot of data points around, and we don't even hear a lot of discussions around. We at Diversify Thinking have held events focused on things like neurodiversity, body size diversity. So different things we're exploring to really try to exploit and educate around what are the different dimensions of diversity. Because without communication, without community, without education, diversity is just what you can see. And there's so much more to that. So it's really multidimensional, quite frankly. And my intention here isn't to overwhelm you, because I think as leaders, as startup leaders or leaders in general, we get overwhelmed around like where to start, and we don't want to say the wrong thing. And so I'm not intending to overwhelm you by saying, hey, there's all these different dimensions of diversity, and now we have equity on the table. I really want to break it down so that you can define it in your own context, and you know that there's no wrong answer. And really what that means is literally writing it down. So step one of this entire journey, if you want to invest in diversity, is writing it down. What does it mean to your organization? It's okay if what you want to focus on is the dimension of gender, because maybe you're heavily swayed in one direction or the other, or maybe you want to entertain the different aspects of gender, and you're not open to that right now. So you want to build in processes around both recruiting and retention and belonging that are focused around those things. But you can't know that, and you can't start that if you don't have your destination planned out. And that's what this is all about. Step one is define what diversity means to you in your context. What is important to you? I've seen some amazing initiatives that I fully support that are around gender. One in particular that a lot of organizations adopted over the last few years was, we want to be 50-50 gender diverse by 2025. Really common. I've seen a lot of taglines around this. And again, I support it, obviously, as a woman in technology, and we are underrepresented. And I think we all know that as we sit here today. It's a very important initiative. But that, just to be clear, that is one dimension of diversity, a very important one, but still one. And so I think just being clear about that and writing it down is the first step. And when I say write it down, I explicitly mean write it down, pen to paper, just like your mission statement or any goal that you would have, or if you put it up on a vision board, like those things, even from a personal perspective, they give you a focus. They give you the objective that you're trying to reach, that outcome. We need that for this too. We need to treat it like we do everything else in our business and in our personal lives, that we're striving to achieve a goal. So the goal has to be defined, and that's what this is all about. So define it. That's your first step in this homework I'm giving you. So now you know what it is. You know that you are looking to diversify your team to be more gender diverse. Let's just say that's what it is. So when do you start? You have a clear picture of where you want to get to. You may even have a timeline of when you want to reach it, but when do you start? And it's immediately. So there's this thing around debt that I want to talk about. And for those of you that are technologists, I see some software engineers that joined us today. For those of you that are technologists, like true technologists, you probably have heard the term technical debt. You may have been the creator of some. I'm going to openly admit that I have created some technical debt in my time. It wasn't because I was a bad person or lazy or a sloppy engineer. It was because we had very clear deliverables that we had to reach by a particular time frame, and we had to cut corners. And that's really where debt comes from. It's when we cut corners or shortcut things to be able to reach an outcome faster. And we know sometimes we're not making the best choices, but we have to, because we have to get it done and we have a deadline. So we always tell ourselves, oh, we'll go back and fix it, right? We don't. We know that. I know that. There was lots of technical debt left behind that ended up being casualties, and we would build on top of it and mask over it, and then over time refactor everything and not even resolve that technical debt. So just know this is no different. The longer you ignore your priority around diversity, you will build that. So just like technical debt, it will build up, and you will just kind of be laying on top of it, and it will create a lot of tension and friction when you're trying to retain employees if you focus on recruiting and not retention, which is why I asked you that in the poll to see if people were experiencing some of this friction today. So you know what it is, and you know what you want to do. What is your goals? And you know you need to start immediately. There is no waiting, because you create this diversity debt and it's very difficult to get out of. So where do you start? You start at the top. You need to start with your leadership team. Why is that? Why is that so important? So for small startups or small teams in a larger corporate context, it matters because your leadership team represents you to a lot of different stakeholders. So ultimately, from a business perspective, your leadership team is the face of your company. It's the face of your company to your customers. So you are attracting and you are relatable to a very specific set of people based on the faces that are out there in the public. Like, so for example, myself as the CXO of adaptation, talking at conferences like this, I'm representing our company. So not only by the thoughts that I'm sharing or the information that I'm evangelizing, but who I am. As a white female, I'm representing our leadership team and our company. So I'm at it's no surprise, I'm at a Women in Technology conference, right? So obviously you guys can relate to me. And so therefore, some of the things I say may resonate more deeply with you because you relate to me as a person. And that's why that matters from a leadership team perspective as well, because who you are is also who you relate to, because we as humans are very comfortable being attracted to and working with and discussing topics or using products from people we trust, people we know, people we can relate to. So this really matters from your customer's perspective. It also matters when you're recruiting people. So 2/3 of job seekers today are looking at the diversity of a company and their leadership team most prominently as, a very high in the list of priorities, which is, a newer thing. So what we're seeing is 2/3 of job seekers are saying diversity is like one of their number one priorities when they're looking at a company. It's the make or break choice whether or not they want to work there. So also super important from attracting talent. And then finally, it's the setting the direction of your company. So that diversity of thought that we led with today really does set the tone and direction of your company. And how open and willing are you going to be to invite diversity of thought if your leadership team is primarily 50-year-old white males? Probably not a lot, probably not a lot. You're not going to get that people thinking independently together. You're probably going to get more of what I like to call groupthink, people sitting around a table nodding at each other. So what is this metric 65%? Why do I have this up here while I'm talking about the diversity of leadership teams? So, startups are really measured by the value, right? So they're measured by their value. There's things that we focus on at startups. So product market fit and revenue. These are the two primary things. We don't necessarily invest in diversity. In fact, 26% of startups, which is sort of a small number on the flip side of this, only 26% actually make a deliberate effort to diversify their leadership. That's a pretty small number. We hope that we can raise that number. So if I talk to you next year, we hope it's more like 50%. But today it's about 26% of startups. And why? Because I, told you their priorities are product market fit and raising revenue. So those two things are the most important things. Now, those 26% that are focused on deliberately diversifying their leadership team are seeing maximum benefits from doing this. So 65% of them have better evaluations because they have at least one ethnically diverse founding member. 63% have better valuations because they have at least one female founder versus an all-male founding team. So the diversity of leadership team also represents the worth of your company out there to people that are willing to invest. So there's the aspect of business value to customers and who you attract because of who you are and what they see out there publicly. But then there's also the value of what investors see. And it's clear if the valuations, like what their companies are worth, are 65% better, then there's definitely a lot of ROI on investing and diversifying their leadership team. So not a small number. 65% is nothing to blink your eyes at. So you know what you want to do with diversity. You've defined it in your context and you've written it down so you can all rally around it. And you know you need to start right away so that you don't accrue diversity debt. And you should start at the top. Well, obviously you'd want to start with hiring, right? So we always think about that. I challenge this a little bit. Like, don't just settle with, I'm going to create this amazing recruiting process that's going to make sure our candidate pool is super diverse. There's a few problems with that. You may already have a team, especially if you're not a startup and you're a larger team or larger organization, a smaller team and a larger organization. Look around. Who could you promote from within to make sure you're diversifying your leadership team, or just giving opportunities, creating an equitable culture so that people have access to the same opportunities, regardless of all the different diversity dimensions. Create pathways. There was a great quote by Melinda Gates years ago now, and she said, "I don't believe there's a pipeline problem. I believe there's a pathway problem." And I second that. I think, there's something to be said for, when we say the pipeline's dried up or there's no talented women out there. That's not true. I know amazing talented women. You were all here today attending here this conference and my session, and you will represent that group of people that they're saying, well, we can't find them. So you need to be deliberate to find them. That's one thing, but they may already be working for you. So I think that's something that, we need to create pathways and support systems that allow these amazing people that represent these diverse dimensions to be able to rise up into leadership and prominent roles within any size organization. So you can't stop with hiring, but in the topic of hiring, there's some things that I do want to recommend. So you'll see a link here. This is a gender decoder. This happens to be a free one. We use it here at Adaptation. Interesting fact about this, and we were really surprised by it. The English language is naturally masculine. And our job descriptions, and I think most startups tend to be like this, our job descriptions are pretty light. That's by design, because we know when we hire someone, there's an opportunity for them to shift laterally and maybe even vertically, like into different roles, depending on what we need at the time, because we're searching for product market fit. So maybe the most important thing next might be from a marketing perspective versus from an R&D perspective. And so we love people that have a really diverse background because it lends really well to that. So some of our job descriptions aren't really targeted. You might not know what your job is every single day because you wear many hats, right? So that being said, as light as our job descriptions are, when we used this gender decoder against them, it was alarming how much masculine language was reported. So I recommend doing this, even if it's just an exercise in curiosity, because I think you'll be surprised. So we use this, and you could also do this on the content on your website as well. Like, is your website inviting to various diverse populations, or is it very masculine? Because the English language, as it turns out, is quite masculine. And so we did this with our job descriptions, and we saw an increase upwards of like 11 to 12% of a more diverse candidate pool applying. So again, nothing like the 65% number I just showed you around better valuations for startups with diverse founding teams, but still not like 0.0001%, like a sizable amount of increased applicants representing different dimensions that we weren't seeing before. So it works, and it's not a lot of effort. It's a free tool. There's lots of other decoders out there. I think someone recently brought to my attention that there was one around race and biased language. So there's a lot to be done there, but explore that, but don't stop there. Like, know that the journey is just beginning when you're inviting people into your organization, and people really want to feel welcome. And that's partly the language you use on the front door, but then there's a bigger part of that, right? So the bigger part is really what happens when they're part of your team. And this matters for lots of reasons. So people often wonder, what is inclusion? What is equity? What are these other variables? Diversity, we always think it's what we see, right? And hopefully I've shown you that there's many different dimensions of diversity to explore versus what you can see. And diversity without communication is only what you can see. But now you've created this diverse team, right? You've whittled your pool down. You've made sure that diverse candidates make it to the second round of interviews. So we use a rule, like a Rooney Rule type adaptation, to make sure that we're moving the diverse candidates through. We're not, for some reason, losing them in the first round or through screening. And we've seen, and studies have shown, that the diverse candidate ends up being the right candidate. So it's not hiring for the sake of box checking. Don't be a box checker. Be deliberate and intentional around it. And you'll be surprised that those diverse candidates are the ones that end up being the ones that you extend an offer to. So, and I've seen it in my own personal experience hiring at my current startup, and then also in prior roles that I've held, in a more corporate context. So it does work if you're intentional about it. So now you've hired them and they're with you. And I told you don't stop there. And that's because this is where the inclusion and equity piece come in. So if employees feel like they need to change who they are or downplay something about them, like something that represents them and who they actually are, whatever that diverse dimension is, and they have to do that in order to be accepted into your culture and to your team, and really feel like they're being valued, that's not inclusion. So if you have anybody on your team today, and by the way to find out is to ask them and really listen. If you have anybody on the team, or you are someone on the team that feels like you have to downplay or change something about who you are in order to feel accepted, that's the opposite of inclusion, right? So like that's probably the most basic definition that I can describe to you. The reason why that's important is because when people come to work fully, right, as their authentic self, and they don't have to downplay or pretend or change anything or feel like they need to, now those people are going to be 100% bought in. They're going to give you all the value they have to give you. And they will be more productive. And that's just, human nature, but also there's studies that have proven that as well. So how do you do that? How do you invite people to be themselves, to feel seen? Well, that comes from any chair, by the way. It's not just leadership that needs to hold the weight here. It should definitely come from leadership. Leadership should encourage diversity of thought and invite other opinions and invite challenge, but it's not solely their responsibility. It's the responsibility of everyone, regardless of your role on the team. The more senior you are, the more influential you are. So even if you're not a leader or a people manager of sorts, you can still have an influence. But it really is everyone. It's encouraging everyone to speak their mind and accepting those opinions. Doesn't mean agreeing. In fact, I would tell you that inviting challenge and having those types of really uncomfortable conversations are where the magic happens. If you're really curious and you invite that challenge, this is where innovation is born. It's when people don't agree, because now you're going to get to something that neither of you have thought of. No one has the right answer. So how do we come together? How do we think independently together to come to something that's truly innovative? So on that vein, inclusive companies, so people that really have gotten this right, where you could survey their employees and they say they do not feel like they have to downplay who they are. They feel that they can come to work as their full selves and they're 100% authentic and they're really belong there, right? That's the word. It's the belong. They feel they belong with this team. Those companies that are truly inclusive are 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders in their market. So almost 2 times more likely to be an innovation leader in whatever market they're in. And you notice I didn't say in artificial intelligence or business intelligence or, robotics. I just said in the market they're in. So it's proven. This comes from real data from Harvard Business Review and other people that are doing data on this. Again, and it's really focused around gender and race. But inclusive companies, people that practice this and are very intentional, are more innovative. It is proven. So it reinforces that idea of thinking independently together and bringing together diversity of thought. It definitely has a positive outcome where you're really, that's where great ideas are born, right? You're not going to, if you don't have friction, you're not going to get those amazing results at the other side of it. So you need to define where your goals are, and you need to start right away and start at the top. You need to begin by your recruiting process and make sure that when you're inviting people to your organization, that you're inviting people of all the dimensions of diversity, but that are aligned with the goals that you've defined it up front. And then once they're there, you can't stop. You've got to create an inclusive environment where, it's equitable for everyone. So let's just for a second, peel back the onion on that. Equitable, what does it mean? It means, and again, in its simplest terms, everybody has access to the resources and the opportunities in the same way. So that's not easy. And it also means we're providing support uniquely for individuals. So on the flip side of that, everyone has access to the same opportunities. They're not looked over for promotions 10 times because they're female, for example. But also, we appreciate as leaders, and this is on leadership, we appreciate as leaders that someone needs something different than someone else. And we create an environment that supports them and their unique needs. That's also part of creating an equitable culture and understanding that we are unique and we all do have different needs and support that we require. And that is mostly on leadership, but also for each other. I heard a great story just yesterday at a workshop I was at, and they were talking about this very large organization, a fintech organization, and they have a business head of diversity and inclusion, and they create all these great events. And one of the colored men in the audience asked a question around, like, how do you enforce it across all the different dimensions of diversity, so it's not just him that represents that dimension going to those workshops. And the panel said very clearly, invite someone else that does not look like you to go with you. And that's not something that has to come from leadership. That's something that you can do. You can lead from any seat, they say, like from anywhere in the organization. Just invite someone that doesn't look like you. Hey, there's this awesome event happening and it's focused around diversity and inclusion. Would you come with me? And you create that bond, and then that person might invite someone else in the future, and sort of creating this environment of belonging where everyone feels welcome and feels like it's an open environment where they can have these very good and necessary conversations. So you're down to the journey where you set your goals and you're starting to march forward. How do you know if you're getting anything right or wrong? Because you will make mistakes. So the way you do that is you measure it. You have to get real about where you're coming from, and you have to write all of that down too. Like, you have to plot it out, just like any business plan. You need to write these things down, or how will you ever know if you made progress? And the things that you need to pay attention to are the people related things. So things like, who were the last 5 people you hired? What did they look like? Did they represent the dimension of diversity that you said was your goal in the beginning when you defined diversity in your context? So are you actually executing against a plan that matches the vision that you put forth, wrote down, and rallied around? Who are the last 5 people that got promoted? Do they all look the same? So is it really an equitable culture? Are you creating a culture where everyone has equal opportunity for leveling up and, moving forward in their career and access to information? So that's how you would identify those things, really measure it and take a good look at it. And then the one that I think, really is important to watch for too, because you can see patterns in this as well. What was the last 5 people to leave your organization? That's going to tell you something about what you need to fix from an inclusion perspective. Why did they leave? Why didn't they feel they belonged there? What was it about your environment that didn't support them? So those are the things that you'd want to measure. So know where you're coming from and know the progress you're making and where you need to invest next. Otherwise, it is really overwhelming. Do I invest in recruiting first? Do I invest in retention? That depends on how big your organization is, how diverse it already is. All of these things you have to answer for yourself, but definitely measure it. Get real about those things and write it down. You'll be surprised by what you learn, and maybe unpleasantly surprised in some cases, but super important to understand that, because you won't know where you're failing and where you're succeeding. So just to recap in the last couple minutes, again, define it in your own context. How is diversity important for you, your team, your organization, whatever that is? Make sure you write it down and have everyone agree that that is the most important place. And it can change, by the way. You can go through seasons in your business evolution, and what matters to you today as you grow your team. If you're doing your job and you measure your results, the next focus may be very different. And you may not have diversity defined in the same way. You might look at exploring another dimension of diversity or multiple dimensions of diversity. So know that it's not a one and done. Like, you can't just write it down and never look back. You will evolve over time. And as we learn, which we're always learning about this, I mean, again, they added E, right? So it's always evolving. Know that this needs to evolve as well. Avoid debt by starting today. So remember, it's just like technical debt. We cut corners because we're trying to reach a goal fast. And with a startup or a small team, like, you're trying to grow pretty fast. And sometimes you don't want to take the effort or the time or slow down to be that deliberate about it. Only 26% of startups today are deliberate. about this sort of level of diversity, but you can see from some of the metrics I shared with you, it has a direct business benefit outside of the fact that it's just the right thing to do, and it creates a better environment for your team and your business. Start at the top. You always want to start with leadership for all the reasons why they represent your company, both internally and externally. Create an inclusive environment by inviting, challenge, and encouraging everyone to speak their minds, that real diversity of thought, and make sure people feel seen and don't feel like they have to strip away or, change or downplay who they really are, like who they really represent, in order to feel like they belong in your organization. Measure. I can't stress that enough. You need to measure it, or you will not know if you're making change happen or making things worse. And both are a very real possibility. And you can measure, by the way, by asking, like I mentioned, how do you know if people are feeling included and feel like they belong? You can ask them and really listen. And that's all part of the measuring process too. It's really important to hear that feedback, listen to it, and, maybe not always agree with it, but acknowledge it and understand and appreciate, to build an empathy across leadership and within your team. And then finally, again, this isn't a one and done. You need to rinse and repeat this. It's going to be an evolution, and you're going to have to do it over and over again in order to really achieve success and achieve some results. So I'm just about at time. So this is who I am. Again, Melissa Jurkoic. If you want to reach out to me to learn more, please feel free to take a snap of this. This is all the different places you can find me. We're doing some exciting stuff at Diversify Thinking around, discovering what people have been doing in the space of inclusion and really around that retention piece. So if you'd like to join us on this journey to see what we're up to or share your own thoughts there, we'd love to hear them. We're always open to a community that wants to make great things happen and influence change. So I invite you to reach out to us on that front if you would like to join us there. And with that, if you have any questions, I see something in the chat. Do you have any strategy to overcome unconscious bias as it comes to diversity and inclusion? Yeah, that's great. I will tell you real quick, because I think closing remarks are starting. The strategy I have is understand and be understood. So it's really around education. And that's one of the things we talk to a lot of people about, because unconscious bias is just that. And there's lots of training and quizzes you can take to identify your own unconscious bias. We all have it across many things, including, like you say, specifically in the area of DE&I. I would say, inviting diversity of thought and having those open conversations and educating people about who you are and wanting to understand who they are is really the basic strategy I can share with you. There's obviously lots of different programs in general around unconscious bias, but it is just that. It's not something that we necessarily know. And the only way we know is to acknowledge it and then educate ourselves. So I always say understand and then be understood. I think those are the two phases of that. But thank you guys for joining. I know that they're doing some closing remarks, and thank you for completing the poll. And it was a pleasure to be here with you today. Take care.